guys, Rich here from the RC Network, and this is my full build review on the brand new Tekno SCT410 2.0. This, of course, is Tekno's new generation 1/10 scale 4-wheel drive short course race truck. In this video, I'll show you what tools were required, how well the owner's manual was written, parts left over, how the kit assembles, what's needed to get this fully up and running, and some of the big differences I noticed between this truck and the 8-year-old outgoing model from Tekno RC. Although this is not a step-by-step assembly video, I'll go over some quirks I saw in the assembly, along with some tips and tricks that might help you with your build. Along with that, I reached out to Tekno and their engineers and asked quite a few questions I had after I completed the assembly that I'll be sharing along the way during this video. Tools needed to assemble your SCT410 2.0 include a 2.5 2.0 and 1.5mm hex driver, a 7.0 and 5.5mm nut driver, a 4mm turnbuckle wrench, a set of needle nose pliers, the Tekno shock shaft pliers, and a good sharp hobby knife. Supplement tools that made the build go even easier include some digital calipers, a 17mm wheel wrench, good sharp hobby scissors, a couple of speed bits, the 2.0 and 2.5mm, and a good electric driver that has an adjustable torque setting. The kit came with thread lock, black grease, 600 and 700 CST shock oil, and 15,000 and 10,000 diff fluid. I also added some chapstick for the turnbuckles and some blue O-ring grease to lubricate the shocks. Parts left over from the kit wasn't much. You have the 2 silver placeholder screws, 2 diff shims, I only used 2 in my build, 4 hinge pin spacers in 2 different sizes, and the 2 motor bolts. That's it. Taking a look at the owner's manual, Tekno always does a great job with her owner's manuals. Great illustrations, great written instructions, just to get you a proper built RC on day one. Now, of course, I've highlighted quite a few things in this owner's manual. Although I didn't find any mistakes, there's some pretty cool little hidden gems inside of this owner's manual that gives ideas towards option parts, as well as just really key things to get your kit assembled properly from day one. So let's go over those. One thing I like to do when I start building a kit is read ahead through that entire bag. I'll highlight some things just to remind me as I'm building, just to make sure I'm doing it correctly. And Tekno does a great job of putting little notes in there just to remind you that things need to happen. Now, always controversial are diff shims. Now, Tekno does give you 2 diff shims per diff. I ended up only fitting 1 in. Now, they specifically say try and fit it in without them. If you feel you need them, you can add them. They give you 2. I only needed 1. I felt comfortable with that diff placement, but everyone will have differing opinions on that. One thing new in this kit are placeholder screws. They're specifically silver in color, and they're just put in place to hold something together until a later step in the build. Now, in this case, there are 2 placeholder screws in this kit, one on the A block, one on the D block, and it just basically holds those 2 blocks into the bulkhead until you're ready to assemble and put the bumpers on. So you'll get a longer screw on those steps, which are actually black. Tekno turnbuckles always go together very easy. They suggest using chapstick, which I've used for years on my RC builds. Just help things go together a little bit easier when you're building those turnbuckles. They also note exactly how to build them in a common sense kind of way, which I appreciate. Up on bag G, you'll notice another placeholder screw. Same thing I mentioned earlier. This one's on the D block now instead of the A block. Just remember, those are silver. Final color will be black. On the follow side, you do have some kingpins that I haven't seen on a Tekno kit before. The top one is a little bit shorter than the bottom one, so just note that as you're building. For bag I, there's one note in there that you have to insert a certain screw upside down into the assembly. It's for a later step when you're assembling the linkage for the servo. It says there that it's almost impossible to do it if you wait till later, so you might as well do it now, but it won't fall out. On bag J, you'll actually see the removal of that silver placeholder screw, introduction of the screw that will take its place going through the front skid plate there into the A block. In bag K, you'll be installing your motor with the new motor mount. Now, this is a fixed place motor mount. It does have spacing for 16 through 20 tooth pinions, but in the gearing recommendations, they actually mention 13 through 15, which is not compatible with the stock motor mount. They do mention that there is a supplementary one that's available, TKR 9511. I couldn't find a listing for it yet, so it must be something that's coming out soon. I would assume it's a sliding motor mount. You should be able to mount either a 13 through 20 tooth on that new sliding motor mount. Also on bag K, you have the ESC mounting options. There's specific hole patterns in there for Tekin, Hobbywing, and Traxxas, so you can actually mount those with screws on the bottom side. Also, please note that your servo will need a very long lead. I would assume about a good 12-inch lead on this particular platform. You have to make it all the way from the front passenger side all the way to the rear driver side where the new radio box is. For bag L, it does give the recommended pattern to mount the Velcro strap. It's suggested to do it before you mount the battery tray, so please make sure you do that. I kind of got kicked up there and I didn't install it. Had to go back and uninstall the tray to put that back in. On bag M, they actually give direction and a little blurb there about an optional center brace that'll be coming down the line. Looks like it's probably going to mount between the two shock towers, but it is kind of unknown at this time. It has turnbuckles on each side. Looks to be quite long. We'll have to wait for that one to come out. When assembling the shocks, make sure you put on the shock spring collar before you put on the boot. The collar will not fit once you have the boot on. I learned the hard way how to remove all 4 boots to put on those shock retaining collars for the spring. Also note that those things are not hard to put on. Once you get them started, you just kind of turn them on. They have the perfect amount of friction. No more sore thumbs putting on those collars. Lastly, this does carry over some of the pro screws that you see on some of the really higher end EB48 models, where you have a black screw that has right hand thread and a silver screw that has left hand thread. So note that when you're assembling this. For the caps, they do make mention that you may have to drill the bleeder hole. I didn't find any of my shock caps needed to be drilled, so you won't have to do that. Also, the caps are finely milled to where once you get them started, they screw right on. In bag P, we actually see the new body mounts. They do mention that you can use the old body mounts if you happen to have those from the SCT410.3. Also, a quick mention of optional air control guards. We also saw those on the previous gen version of the SCT. Those should fit on here. Not sure if they're the same model number, but they are mentioning that those air guards will be available. Finally, also in bag P, there's a mention of actual Tekno wheels. Yes, Tekno does make SCT wheels for their short course trucks, so no more buying the Losi specific SCTE wheel offset anymore. These are perfectly offset for the SCT410 2.0 and also the SL. Assembling the Tekno SCT410 2.0. Well, here we go with bag A and the center differential. Such familiar parts on these diffs. I was mistaken during the unbox. This is practically the same size. They work so well, are super smooth, and have just refined over the years. Center diff calls for 15,000 diff fluid, filled to about 2 millimeters below the top. Bag B, we set into the front and rear diffs. Nearly the same parts as the center, just with metal spurs, which are finely made. Here's a pro tip. I take a silver Sharpie and mark the diff cup with the weight of oil. 10,000 in the rear, 15,000 in the front. All 3 diffs are now assembled and waiting to be installed in the chassis. Nothing but top quality stuff here from Tekno. They all spin like butter. No notchiness or clicking like you see in other brands' kits, where they utilize 20 to 30 shims to make them work. Bag C, we are getting in the front gearbox, including a 4mm aluminum shock tower, steel standoffs, and some optional diff shims. I noticed the pinion set screw takes a 2.5mm wrench, so it's nice and beefy. As for the optional shims, I was able to fit just 1 shim on the non-drive side of my differential. This will vary by builder, so test yours as you build. As usual, the diff spins freely just sitting in the gearbox. The front diff gets a fully sealed trap door, and she's all buttoned up now. The famous D-bag gets into the rear gearbox with much of the same as the front, with the exception of the tiny universal drive shaft that mounts directly to the pinion, and the trap door that's been modified with 2 openings. I also found that only 1 diff shim was needed in the rear gearbox, just like the front. Don't forget to grease those rear diff gears. Both gearboxes are now ready for the chassis. Bag E continues with the rear gearbox, adding the sway bars, A-arms, and the all-new steel reinforced C and D blocks. The A and D blocks have visible evidence of the steel, but I'm told by Tekno that all of the holders have that feature. Testing the A-arms to see if they they need to be reamed, and that's a big negative. They're set to go from the factory with a beefy 4mm hinge pin. The D block utilizes a silver holder screw to keep things together until a future step, so please make that note. Overall, the suspension arms are very free and have zero stiction. Bag F shows off more quality parts, including flanged bearings, universal drive shafts, and 4mm steel turnbuckles. The stub shafts on the universals measure a beefy 6mm, like usual on Tekno SCTs. The hub carriers go together nicely and have zero play. The rear section is ready for business now and has some great action. It's 100% free. Bag G buttons up the front gearbox with similar items we saw in Bag E. Practically solid arms and those all-new steel reinforced A and B blocks. Looking at the sway bar, it gets trickled down from the EB48 lineup using a bushing to keep the action smooth. Bag H, we see more flanged bearings, those new steel kingpins, universal drive shafts, and the all-new front spindle and carrier assemblies. The kingpins come in two sizes, with the shorter going on the top side of the assembly. The flange bearings are a nice addition as they seat in perfect with no errors that can be made. The new kingpins have a set pin that captures them. Note the flat side of the kingpin for orientation. All assembled, they are very fluid with zero slop. Beefy is a common word on this chassis. The front and rear sections are now done. Bag I begins the steering assembly with very familiar parts, many aluminum parts, and everything rides on bearings to keep it smooth. Like all Teknos, use some Loctite on the main threaded body and crank it all the way down. A 17mm wheel wrench works perfect, and then just back it off 2 full turns. Steering assembly is ready for the chassis. Bag J finally brings in the new aluminum chassis and the front bumpers, aluminum steering posts, and all the braces and supports. You'll have 2 M3 screws that hold the front bulkhead to the chassis. This sits underneath the front skid plate. One of the trickiest parts I found on this build was the front shock tower support. I found that angling it in and wedging it against the tower was the best method. It really triangulates everything on the front. Now for that silver placeholder screw, it's time to exit the building. You'll get a longer black screw in this step that goes through the front skid plate and into the A block. Bag K gets us the passenger side of the chassis, ESC tray, and the motor mount. One of the biggest change was the 7075 aluminum one-piece motor mount. It has prefixed positions for 16-tooth to 20-tooth pinions in that classic Tekno gray color. The ESC tray looks similar to the other 2.0 vehicles, and I noticed the holes which align to either Tekin, Hobbywing, or Traxxas branded ESCs. The motor mount has a thick plastic piece that gets attached, which acts as a center chassis brace. Speaking with Tekno, this is a tuning option, but the team hasn't felt a need to remove it at this point. The chassis sides are definitely a little higher than the previous gen, which is all better to keep out dirt and debris. The chassis side is affixed nicely and blends in well on the underside of the chassis plate. Bag L completes the driver's side of the truck with a new battery tray, a metal 25-tooth servo horn which is included, the receiver box lid, and the antenna. Fair warning, install the Velcro strap before you mount the battery tray. I kind of learned this the hard way. The tray can easily mount larger 3S and 4S packs if needed, and the wide EB48 strap is a nice addition as well. The kit includes some gates that create a wire path for your servo and ESC wires to route, which is really nice. Tekno thought of all the little details on this one. Bag M wraps up mounting the rear of the truck with a center diff mount, the spur gear cover, and center drive shaft, chassis braces, and rear bumpers. With the center diff re-emerging, it gets mounted in Tekno fashion toward the last third of the truck. One big surprise was the completely enclosed center diff and gear mesh. It looks pretty solid too, and should keep the majority of the debris out. Some will like this for bashing, where racers in clean environments may want to delete it. Here's a quick look of the truck so far. It's shaping up. I always do shocks last, so let's skip to bag P, which is the final bag of the build. Body mounts, Nerf bars, and bumpers. The body mounts are a huge improvement over the 410.3s as they have a pivoting body mount now. They're also very stout and can take a ShortCourse Truck beating. Lined up on the shock tower in the lowest position, you'll have to trim the bottom of the mounts to not interfere with the suspension travel. Front bumper looks similar to the 410.3s, but it's a two-piece design now, which is nice. Great job on whomever designed the rear bumper. So much went into this, and you can really tell by both the looks and that cool little inset plate. It just looks great. The Nerf bars are Nerf bars. Now, the shocks, bags N and O. I was pretty skeptical on the 13mm shock bodies, yet 16mm springs. Speaking with Tekno, they tested both 16 on 16 and 13 on 16, and many of the guys felt the performance on the 13mm shock bodies were way better than the 16. So I'll take that. I'm pretty OCD when setting up my shock builds, so yeah, it's pretty organized. The rears get a slightly longer body and shaft, but not by much. Fronts get 5-hole 1.2mm pistons on 700 weight oil, and rears get 5-hole 1.1mm pistons on 600 weight oil. Stock setup provides everything for an emulsion style setup, which I like. Shock collars and caps all threaded on nicely. The look of the shocks and the feel is perfect. Very smooth. Now that the chassis is built, what else do you need to get this thing all up and running? You'll still need an ESC, motor, servo, battery, radio system, wheels, tires, body, and paint. I'm sure there's other little things like tire glue, ESC plugs, but I'll cover that in the next video, so stay tuned. Overall, Tekno did a great job on this 2.0 update of their four-wheel drive short course truck. It was a long time coming, but they really refined an already great truck. I'm really fond of the little things, like the chassis layout being a bit more open, the strengthened shock towers with the additional bracing, the bumpers that really make the truck look a little bit more realistic, the metal reinforced suspension holders, and the shocks, they feel surprisingly smooth and really have a great premium look. I'm also noting a few things that we take for granted with Tekno, like the A-arms are literally indestructible, being nearly solid yet race friendly. The steering has probably the best feel and near zero slop, and the diffs are really an industry standard that many companies just struggle with. Well, that's my full build review, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. How do you think Tekno did with this 2.0 update? Did they hit it out of the park? Post your comments down below. As always, if you liked the video, there's a button for that. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell to be notified anytime I upload a video. Finally, my name is Rich. Thanks for watching.